Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining, and very excited to chat with my colleagues today as we've got several topics on that. So we're excited, and we'll jump right in. So our first one is we're just going to go over one or two sort of what I call table setting slides, and then we're going to get into hopefully some Q&A, and we'll ask some chat questions of the group. The first sort of problem that we start to see out there in the money laundering world is it's not just banks. There are all kinds of categories. It's even going out into reservation systems like Airbnb and casinos and those kinds of things. But the numbers are staggering, right? The second component that we start to see then is that it's more complicated. Now our basically our government folks are trying to get better at it. They're enforcing fines like they never have. Those fines are getting even higher. The technology that are basically our negative folks in the world that are trying to steal our money are getting more sort of up the ante on their side. And so all of these different categories of where it is and how it happens, it really starts to press in on some of the things we're going to see here in a minute, which is multiple silos. They may start in one silo, such as coming in as a spoofed ID, and then they move over from cybercrime to money laundering to fleecing and smurfing and all those kinds of things. So the numbers are staggering, and they're not getting any better. The second thing then is, what are these different elements, right? They're no longer taking a couple of dollars here and there, right? So as I mentioned previously, it's not just one group of people. Before, the silos of cyber were not necessarily connected to AML and how that works. And that's why we're so excited today to talk to our panel is how does a Microsoft ecosystem, how does a graph technology like Tiger Graph start to fit into this? How does that sort of aggregation really start to play into how can we not just play whack-a-mole on one of these different kinds of things? And then we see this thing called KYC. A lot of the data that we use for a positive experience in the technology world, a lot of the algorithms and machine learning and those kind of things really are nearly identical to KYC. But is it KYC? No, it's a negative journey. They're trying to steal our money. They're trying to launder the money. And then the human will absolutely play a part of that. So again, these are kind of the table stakes. Then we get to things like ransomware. Well, now they've come in through a cyber connection. They may look like a good citizen, and then suddenly they backdoor and start to do some horrible things to where we're going. And so what we want to talk about now is how do we avoid that, in addition to that myriad of other kinds of things like AML, right? They're similar and how they're coming in and their tactics. They may end up doing all of those. They may end up coming in on cyber and stealing some bank account money and then ransomwaring, and then they may have laundered money in the middle. And so the concept here now is kind of overwhelming. That really gets us to these different use cases. What is it that we're trying to do? So what we want to spend our time on today is really how do we take all of the different use cases, money laundering, AML, cyber, IoT, claim dispute, law enforcement, and prosecution. How do we then use the concepts of technology and the platforms, and what are these at our fingertips? But let's do it in a business way. And I think that's really what happens, is this intersection in the middle. That's what we want to talk about today as we step into that. Now, when we see the other half of this, which is if you don't do it right, if you're not conscribing to the AML Act and you're not doing it, the other side of this is not only are they taking the money, or not only are they ransomwaring us, not only are they doing that, there's the fine or the specter of what happens if you don't do that. And these are also very big. So now we have basically sharks on all surrounding areas of us that can be in different flavors, right? They could be, we're not doing, or we're doing enough, we're trying as hard as we can, but we don't have enough technology to do it. Or humans are overwhelmed, or there may be just different kinds of conspirations of clusters of bad people that are attacking us because maybe they know that we don't have enough sort of capability to respond in kind. And so this is now sort of that last leg of what we want to talk about today. So again, how did we do that? Well, now let's set the stage. So the AML legislation talks about the idea of codification, modernization, expanding the enforcement, that disclosure and sharing And then finally, de-risking. What we'd like to do today is take these concepts, and again, everybody can sort of read this. I won't read it for you. But the point of this is these are all very, very important elements that the sort of our table today is let's talk now as a group, and let's share what some of our insights are on these different categories. And that will now lead us to our Q&A. And so with that, I'd like to talk a little bit to our distinguished colleague, Harsh Sharma from Microsoft and Michael Shaler from TigerGraph. And what we want to do, guys, is let's talk a little bit about this. And so, Harsh, I don't know if you want to start off with maybe some Chatham House rules and sort of have our discussion here be open and free-flowing.
Sure. Scott, first of all, thank you for the invite. Pleasure to be here. And hello to all the participants. Great opportunity to share, as Scott, you said, under the Chatham House rules, more like an industry colleague, some of the experimentations, learnings I have from the world of financial services I lived in, and some of the techniques, tools that help address what I call the regulatory conundrum, an intelligent approach to a lot of the regulatory mandates. Scott, happy to go into specific topics or just share with you my kind of a reaction to when a new regulation such as AML Act of 2020 or similar show up at a bank's,
Yeah, why don't you do two things, which is in our first question here, which is looking at the AML Act, right? Those are some nice words there. Why don't you tell us sort of what Microsoft is doing, thinking, and or maybe your personal opinion, as we mentioned under Chatham, sort of just talk a little bit about that sort of set of questions in question number one.
Sure. So let me share with you how at a bank we reacted to some of these regulatory directives, including the AML Act of 2020, et cetera. And now I'm seeing the same from our customers and partners working with us. So a new regulation comes up. We all know that regulation is complex, is highly semantically nuanced. So the first challenge is, here is one more directive. How does it impact my products and services? Do I have the right data? How do I comply it in an intelligent manner that it does not become regulation per regulation? AML Act also says you need to report back ultimate beneficial ownership, for example. Do I have the right data? So this is where I started researching into, what are some of the machine learning, data and AI type of techniques and capabilities out there that will, let's say, ingest the regulation, the directive, and apply machine intelligence to understand the key concepts. Now correlate that with what data sets you might need, the context, your products, services, et cetera, all that connectivity, if you will. And this is where I started experimenting with knowledge graph techniques. And I'm sure Michael Shaler and you will talk more about that. But in my view, some of these techniques applying data and AI help with that, what I call low code codification and touchless kind of interpretation of some of these regulatory directives to not only have a sustainable approach to addressing compliance, but also in a better cost efficient manner. And as I call, regulation need not be a burden. How do you turn that burden into benefit and lower your risk to compliance? To me, that's where the opportunity lies.
Fantastic. Well, and so Michael Shaler, as distinguished colleague, obviously in the graph space, what is your thoughts on question number one, and sort of how would a technology, change that? And what have you been seeing, and kind of what do you think for 2022 is kind of going on in that first set of questions?
If we look at the six categories that AML 2020 AML legislation kind of pushes forward, we really do need to be able to quantify risk in different ways, and do that with algorithms and drive accuracy. And so we still need humans in the loop. We need graph algorithms to give us insights into the connected nature of money laundering. And then we also need to then kind of ensure that we're looking for connections with, understanding non-obvious connections. And the way to think about that is that, we want to ensure that, as Harsh said, we want to, kind of decrease risk, and we want to have turn a burden into benefit. But the way to bridge from our existing legacy systems to a modern view of that, we obviously think of that as a graph-shaped problem. But where we really end up going is that we are able to see into long links of transactional chains that highlight how money laundering moves from, basically, from the placement, layering, and integration piece into kind of all 6 layers of the AML legislation. So a summary is, we see this as primarily a connected data problem, and we can work with existing systems to drive outcomes that can't be achieved by any other means.
Gotcha. And Harsh, in our second question here, this is almost an early warning system. So we know that, with some of the technologies that your team brings to bear, and just an example is adverse media, right? What is it? And also for the group that are here, Harsh also came to us. He used to be part of something called the EDM Council, which was a large consortium on anti-money laundering and other kinds of things. But Harsh, in this sort of early risk warning or adverse media, what kinds of things are you seeing in 2022? We're hearing a lot about that, but maybe tell us a little what your thoughts are around that.
Sure, Scott. So one observation, and that actually led to that cross-industry effort to develop, the prototype for knowledge graphs, was banks are, of course, doing KYC entity matching resolution for a long time. They've spent a lot of money and effort into that process. But because of the information flows so real time and things happening across the world, how do you integrate external data ecosystems? What I mean by that is there are watch lists out there, adverse news media, events happening, a politically exposed person. So you might have done due diligence on the KYC side, but might not be due again. But in the meanwhile, something important happened about this entity or a customer that you should know in almost near real time. And this is where I saw that organizations were eager to harness some of the public and open data sets, like open corporate registries or FATF watch lists, FinCEN watch lists, et cetera. How do you connect that data? And the challenge was to, of course, are you looking at the same entity? So that entity resolution and matching algorithms need to be super smart in terms of tracking this across these internal and external data ecosystems, and be able to say that we are looking at the same entity and the risk they pose. And one interesting observation out of this entire exercise was everybody wants to share data, but because of privacy and other reasons, they cannot. And this is where I started looking at confidential computing, for example. How can organizations put their data into these ultra-secure enclaves and cross-train their models on each other's data to identify or basically improve the models, as well as learn the risk of various entities involved in various type of transactions, especially anti-money laundering related or cross-border money flow type of events. So again, long story short, here again, I saw that the graph algorithms and connectedness of the graphs help connect these internal and external ecosystems of data, and it provide additional entity intelligence, as I call it.
Well, I think that's a great segue into question 3, which is, Michael, there's a lot of questions here, right? So, there's screening and prediction and different silos within a bank or an organization that need to be sort of stitched together. What kinds of things do you see in, both from what I call what your team has been working on in the technology area for 2022, and sort of when you're done, then sort of maybe pull on that thread that Harsh talked about in some of those questions there on question 3.
Well, I think one of the key challenges is obviously, as always, especially banks, but other organizations, inevitably have a life cycle of technology. And oftentimes what we see is that they're running on gas or gas fumes when it comes to their AML core systems. The challenges obviously are that, you can't easily express some of these questions in traditional query languages or approaches that are going to be, like Harsh said, we really do have a lot of external data we need to be tracking closely here. What that means for really being able to have an aggregation source, and then also have an ability to have an insight source. And so between those two, the aggregation and the insight, we actually are able to, really leverage both transactional chains in time and geospatially. But what we really need is to be able to span all of these different functions and have a great view, a unified view of what that all means. And that means we're going to have ETL systems and machine learning systems, and we're going to have humans in the loop. And as Harsh said, with Azure confidential computing, for example, that enables secure data sharing. And that enables us to also, with confidence, be able to say, okay, we know now that we can actually connect the data, we can share it, we can do that securely, privately, and repeatably. And we can actually then start again to move from burden to benefit. And so I think that the summary is that when we're starting to bring together these various systems, connect them, understand their relationships, understand the content of those systems, the transactional value, and then also be able to identify, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. And it's important to note that crime rings operate differently, and they have evolved. And that's what prompted the AML 2020 Act. And that also is why banks are looking, and other organizations are looking for ways to optimize their KYC functions, their screening functions, and then also how they surface alerts and outcomes. So I think the summary here is that, we're looking for ways to aggregate, and we're looking for ways to, derive insight and move investigations faster.
Well, I think that's a great segue to our next section, which is, there's lots of products out there. And typically what we see then is this, lots of products. And we love all the different products that are out there. There's Oracle and Actimize and SaaS and so on and so forth, and custom solutions and all that. And I think that's now, let's shift over to a little bit about now, over to you, Harsh, which is, how can Microsoft start to take all of that myriad of technology, and then how do we make this a bit more real? And so why don't you sort of walk us through now kind of how Microsoft is sort of approaching this?
Sure, Scott, thank you. So learning from various experiences, what I was trying to build here at Microsoft, and we have made good progress on, is what I call a test bed, where customers, partners, is almost an ecosystem where graph-powered cyber anti-fraud type of use cases can be co-experimented, co-ideated with on the Azure platform. And that brings capability, bring your idea, bring your data, co-experiment with us, and working with Expero and TigerGraph and our internal product teams, we are building this incubation test bed where you could have, for example, you might be interested in industry standard like FIBO, Financial Industry Business Ontology, or you might have your own data models. We have, of course, several industry data models, but you might have your own internal enterprise data model, for example, and library of algorithms to try out. For example, Michael, you and Scott, the graph algorithms, Louvain or shortest path between entities or clustering algorithms, et cetera. And we are building continuously some graph widgets, like that's for insider threats or other type of kind of connected graph widgets, if you will. And I'll talk in the next slide about how we are adding the power of Office 365 data. This has been an interesting journey for me also coming into Microsoft, the human part of it. And we have this untapped data ecosystem, the Office 365 data, and leveraging Microsoft Graph Data Connect, we're starting to see a whole variety of use cases across the ecosystem. What is interesting is in the context of this topic, how do you identify insider threats, rogue traders, or workforce efficiency, for example? In other cases, mapping the skills of the employees to various other type of insights you may want to harness. And optimization of workforce. In fact, one of the banks, when they acquired another organization, they want to use the Outlook, the team, chat logs, SharePoint, other Office 365 data sets to do workforce integration, optimization of the skill sets. How do you develop a customer 720, as I call it, high net worth individuals relationships? Maybe somebody moved from Miami to Seattle, and what does this event mean for them in terms of the portfolio of products they use? So long story short, again, this is a great data set to further augment your graph techniques, as well as the insights you might be looking to derive from your data set. Thanks, Scott. So here is just an example of the industry standard many of us have been involved in. And without going into the details, basically the key point here is that the financial industry participants came together under the auspices of Enterprise Data Management Council. And we developed this industry vocabulary, if you will, or the language of the Wall Street. And that addresses key areas like, the legal entity relationships, the financial instruments, taxonomies, et cetera. But what's critical here is that this ontology becomes machine readable. For example, at Microsoft, we bring this ontology, we have industry data models, leveraging machine intelligence, we connect them all together. And then tools like Azure Purview, when you're looking at multi-cloud or hybrid data estates, how can you track and trace these relationships and the consumption of that data, who governs these data sets, et cetera. So building that 360 across your data estates is another way we are leveraging some of these industry ontologies and standards. Next. Thank you. Scott, I think some of the participants might have been aware of this effort, but I'll just summarize it. So last year, under the auspices of Enterprise Data Management Council, many of us came together, and the members always ask, so what's a graph? How does it work? Show me in real life. So instead of just talking about the architectures, et cetera, and of course, on the top left, this audience knows the business challenge, so I'm not going to go into that. But the opportunity that was identified together was, how do we employ graph techniques for enhanced entity intelligence, for example? Automate or make it touchless in terms of onboarding due diligence, for example. And obviously the ongoing challenge of accuracy of the financial crimes investigations, the 90% false positives, et cetera. But overall, how do we load the risk of dealing with the bad actors? And we brought together almost 70 plus global participants. And this effort was led by the financial crimes experts, folks who were running anti-money laundering KYC programs across various financial institutions, and of course, the data experts and the risk experts. And the goal was how in 90 or 100 days, we leverage some open data sets, because we were not going to get banks' transactional data. So how do we develop a prototype to show how graphs add value here? And how do we build this prototype so that banks can take these artifacts and experiment it internally and come back and share their experiences? So we built an entity network graph. Some of the folks contributed a risk model to experiment with. We enhanced the FIBO standard for AML KYC concepts. And we also got open corporate registry data, including some of the open ownership type of data sets. So what were some of the value kind of KPIs or metrics we observed out of this exercise? One pilot we did with a mid-sized bank was for 15,000 alerts, leveraging the graph intelligence approach. We projected that about 5 million in savings across this alerts management investigation process. This was one pilot we conducted. The second pilot was Obviously, data mapping to some of these industry ontologies, or even otherwise, if you're mapping a new data set, is a laborious manual process. So one of the council members brought together some of their algorithmic horsepower and demonstrated that up to 40 to 60% efficiency could be achieved when you're mapping disparate data sets either to a FIBO or another target model, for example. So again, demonstrating power of data and AI here. Two opportunities came out of this. When we demonstrated the technique, or it was more like, teach us how to fish, if you will. One opportunity was, could this entity intelligence powered by graph, could this be a service, especially mid-sized market, 3,000 credit unions, the banks, could they leverage this? So this is still an ongoing discussion. Would welcome any participation, feedback, conversations on that. And the other opportunity, as we highlighted earlier, nobody wants to share their data. So as a pilot, out of this experiment we did together, there are 3 banks we are working with where we brought the Azure confidential computing platform. One of the banks brought their human trafficking risk models. Others are bringing their transaction data. They'll put this into these ultra secure enclaves, what we call data in use being protected, leveraging Intel's SGX technology, and we can get into the details if there is interest later. So just to summarize, this gives us a great way for different organizations, A, to cross-train their risk models or other type of models, infuse the power of Office 365 for workforce intelligence, optimization, et cetera. And quite frankly, this is an ecosystem where we can all benefit from co-ideation, co-experimentation. That's the take-home message. How do we make graphs the household word in the financial industry? Learn by doing it.
All right, Harsh, that's really fantastic. And I think that's really kind of what we're going to talk now is that sort of course that Harsh laid out there. That's really, I think, where we're going next. Is what I'd like to do now is actually show a couple of the live demos. So you heard Harsh talk about what some of these concepts were, but maybe now let's see it in action. And again, thank you so much, Harsh, for that view there.
Sure, happy to answer any questions later on, and welcome any comments, thoughts. Thank you.
Super. Well, I think what Michael Shaler and I are going to talk a little bit about now is what we've done then is we've created this unified and modular solution, which is if you're out looking at how to increase accuracy, decrease the false positives, you heard Harsh talk about why this is so incredibly important. And I think the goal here is to use the power of graph. The number one thing that we see in all of the customers at Expiro is one size does not fit all. There are people that have case management and alert management, but they don't have deep link analysis or don't have the ability to combine their existing Boolean alerts with some of these other items. And this is why, is that being able to do these things has given rise to what we'll see here in a minute, which is what we refer to as Tiger Shield. And why? Well, what we start to see now is you can be a technologist and you have a part to play. This is the old adage of touching the elephant in different ways. You may need to create the data, and because graph creates an automatic join, if you will, and the way the data and the data model are stored are in real time, you need to touch that elephant perhaps with a different set of screens. You need to build the algorithms. You need to write the data model. You need to ingest the data. There are a lot of different sort of parts to that. And what now we go up the stack with is, regardless of where you are in the organization, whether you're technology or machine learning or investigation or alert, there is a place, there is a screen, there is a way that you can interact now with this capable knowledge graph, and specifically Tiger graph of why it's so unique in this. And what we now start to see then is there are different ways to do that. And as I'm leading up to mine, I'll be showing demos of each of those different elements. And these can again be standalone as modules, or they can be combined in one type. But what starts to happen now is, if you are more on the business side, those different units that you heard Harsh talk about, which is the ability to identify cyber in real time, look at how cyber may turn into account takeover and then credit card fraud that turns into AML. These are no longer simple siloed activities, and the ability to create a federated data set and or a data model and then still allow the different investigation units to have need to know basis. But when it makes sense and when the system creates this aggregate or higher level view with machine learning is where we start to get the true power of what a graph can bring to us. And that's really what we're trying to show in this style of a screen here, is that each of those different groups, anti-money laundering, we've heard sort of why we're here today, but it very much ties into that, and Michael Shaler will talk about that later. Now, what are the modules? And again, if you have other products out there today, you may see these as, oh, I've already got those. But I think what you're about to see is that these can be enhanced with a graph solution where these other items can plug into your existing case management or your existing alerts, or this, what we call deep link analysis in the Explorer or analytics. And again, these are modules that can be done separately or together as your business and as your need changes. And I think that's the other thing that we're going to see today, is that this chart is pretty heady. And this is where you saw Harsh lay that out, is empirically, the customers are finding that, yes, if I add one item, which is now I want to increase it with machine learning, well, that's great. What do I now want to do with graph plus visualization? Take that deep link capability, in addition to combining that machine learning in a graph database and harnessing the visualization. That's where we're starting to get that enormous lift. And that's looking at current data that perhaps other systems have overlooked and then finding this in the same data. And that's what we see here, which is a couple of use cases here. These are banks that we've worked with, and what we found was over and above the existing products that they already had, and they had, you know, no end of time, money, and expense that they are spending on it, and their human need was starting to go up. By augmenting that with this graph style solution, we have found an enormous boom. Now, does that mean that we're saying rip it out? No, we are not. What we're saying is you can augment in a very fast way to find all kinds of fraud, whether it's AML or credit card and some of the other things we mentioned like cyber, to be able to do that. And I think that is the real core takeaway here, is investing in something like this where we can really start to enhance those numbers and the percentages of decrease in false positives. We recently ran an empirical run with one of our customers, and it was a 60% decrease in false positives. And that was empirical. We went back and looked at different kinds of benchmarking along the way and find, how does this work? Now that's what we'd like to dig in here, is how does that happen? Well, with a graph database, we can start to then create these categorizations or machine learning. You heard Harsh mention about graph algorithms. Michael's going to talk about that a little later, but using things like Louvain modularity, looking for clustering and similarity, we can very simply, and this is a view of what graph data looks like in the graph, we can very quickly see that the vectors and the features inside of that, down in the purple down here, are clearly different than the ones that are more normal across the top. Well, if we teach the graph to look for those now in real time, in 10 milliseconds or under, we can look at massive sets of data and instantly categorize good, investigate, or bad. And then even better is we can start to do the deep link connective analysis so that we can train the model, start the loop, and then run it all over again. And that's really at the core of what a graph database can do. Now, how does Microsoft fit into this? Obviously, in an Azure tenant, and Michael also has a deeper slide on sort of how do the actual parts inside of Microsoft fit. But what you heard Harsh say was taking all of this data across the top, whether it's a black list, a gray list, a white list, other products scoring capabilities, even your own customer data can all very quickly plug in. We don't have to go build new feeds for this. We plug into ones that are already there, and in as fast as 12 weeks, this can be plugged in. Now you see our component over here for Microsoft 365. That's very important, is whether it's through emails or sentiment or our website or all of the host and suite of products that Microsoft brings to us, we now bring the accuracy of the signal up significantly. And we can now plug it directly into this graph analytic engine for scoring or rescoring in here. There are two different ways to see that, which we mentioned previously, is if I'm a technology person, I can see it in the Tiger Graph Studio, which is a console for IT persons. And then what I'm going to be showing today is more on the business side. How do you consume the power of that graph? Now, here's a couple of examples, and we'll see live ones here in a minute. But what we start to give then is prescriptive. We can see that perhaps another system has scored an approval, but with the deep link analysis, we can now quickly pop out to a level 1 investigator, perhaps in this case, that says, you should reject this. Now what I'd like to do is dig in a little deeper. Why, human? And the answer here is that maybe I have found communities, maybe I have found clusters. There are links to phone numbers or other kinds of attributes. Maybe there's a geography component that also overlays this. So now what we're doing is very simply showing in a simple way here. In this case, this is potentially for insurance, right? So it doesn't have to be banking. It doesn't have to be any of these other categories. The models and the math that we do here are really somewhat ubiquitous across insurance and again, those other categories. The other thing that we can start to do now is, how does that human, the human still matters, believe it or not. A lot of people will say that the Borg is taking over and the systems are going to take control. That's just not the case. What we start to see now is the human very much models into this, which is if the machine learning inside of a graph database makes a recommendation, the human still needs to attenuate that and say, yes, that is actually okay. Perhaps someone has purchased a boat and they have sold it or whatever that may be, and that lump sum is normal. And yes, it looks abnormal, but the human says that is something that's there. Or maybe there's an insurance claim where there is a good reason why the rest of the family may have different connections to our insurance claim for where that is, right? And this is the way now for that human to come in and say, this is good or that's bad. And perhaps what you can see here is they can attenuate that and say, only show me things in the future that are of a higher risk category, and the rest of them I'd like for you to automatically take care of. So again, we're lowering that process capability. We're increasing the accuracy and we're decreasing the false positives now with that third leg of the human. Now, let's switch over and see a quick demonstration. In my first demonstration, I'm actually going to talk about how do we do that first concept. So you heard Harsh and Michael talk about how do I take this data from these multiple areas. It could be as simple as my customer data. It may be as simple as these other elements that we see here. And what I want to do now is I actually want to go add a new data source. In this case, maybe I want to do something like Hadoop or Mongo or whatever those data sources are. But now perhaps what I'd actually like to do is change this from simple entity resolution to that first leg of what we call risk connection, right? How do we start to now do something more than just connect the data from those other data sources, right? And that first leg now is now I want to look against blacklist information. First thing that I can do is I can start to dig in here, right? What I can start to see now is these different elements that are here. What are those data entities? How do I start to do that? I can now start to do matching. I can do fuzzy matching. I can do connected data. I can do negative sentiment. I can do, Bloomberg or those other categories of things, and realize that maybe the data that I have or a new person coming in, there may be more to this than just simply what looks good inside of my system. So now what I can do is I can start to say, do I want to do simple comparison or record A and B? Then what I'd like to do is move it up a notch and start to look at risk identification, which is even more complicated. Then once I've connected that data, I can start to say when and what do I want to do with this. In this case, I've created workflows. Those workflows are what we'll see here in a minute to be able to come through this. So now what I've done is I've started to build that. I can come through now and say, well, I've identified something here in this dashboard where that connection, there's a high geography risk, there's been a change in behavior, there's been rapid movement, and now I'm showing high risk. Now, again, in that sort of layer cake, if you will, for different users, this may be a level 2 investigator. In your organization, it may be a level 1 investigator. It could go either way. So that's our vignette number 1. That's sort of that first leg, which is how do we take the data and what do we do with it? In this example now, I sort of have taken it from the data connection to the entity resolution. The second version that I'd like to do now is maybe now I'm actually in a department. Maybe I'm in the AML group. Maybe I'm in the claims group at an insurance company. Maybe I'm in the high net worth investigation and AML department, right? This is a configurable dashboard. What we can now do is show things like alerts. And those alerts, as we saw previously, can be made up of Boolean and other kinds of logic. But in this case, I want to see what is the distribution? What is going on in my department, perhaps? Maybe I want to see what those things look like in a specific region, right? Now what I can do is from here, if I'm a super user, perhaps what I want to do now is go look at alerts, or maybe this is a separate dashboard for my alert management team where they want to go do investigations, or I can do groupings or case management. Now, as we mentioned before, these are all modular. You don't necessarily have to get them all, but this is the way these start to fit together. Now, in our previous one, we talked about those alerts. Maybe now I want to go set up a new alert. What we can see over here is I can go grab things like Boolean logic. And this logic could sit in your Oracle or your Actimize or your custom system. Where it really starts to stand tall now is now what I'd like to do is every transaction from a high-risk country, Mexico, and now what I'd like to do is apply that graph algorithm. I can pick here now Tiger Graph, and maybe I want to do Louvain, and every customer name that has been connected to a SAR or other kinds of events, I now want to take that Boolean logic with a graph algorithm, and I can build as many of these as I like. I can do how many transactions during a day. There are other categories here. Maybe I want to run a second Tiger Graph algorithm where I'm looking at maybe it's page rank or strength of connection based on a phone number or a MAC ID, or again, any piece of data that is in that environment. So once I've done that, I can now come up here and I can start to do actions. You saw previously that we can do workflow. In this case, I can do other kinds of things. Maybe I want to send it to another system, et cetera. Now, once I've built those alerts back in my dashboard, I can now start to take it another level. So maybe I want to go look at some new alerts. Now, in this case, we're looking at certain types of alerts for money orders or wire transfers. Again, this could be claims management or cyber intrusions, et cetera. And we can go do that. And what I'd like to do is disposition this in a quick manner. You saw a previous screen where we can go do that. Now what I do is very simply, in this case, I've shown to this human that, look, there are 4 cards and 5 devices. That's a reason why you should take a pause. Also, what I can do is I can see what other transactions their disposition has been. Now, if I want to, I can actually go into the graph and say, now I see that this transaction is connected to 5 open cases, right? That's probably a bad thing. I can double click my way through this and say, well, that card was in other transactions. That transaction ultimately shows there is a person in red that has been known to be flagged with fraud. So in a couple of mouse clicks now, I've done that entity step. I've now connected the data. I've created an alert. And now what I'm doing is I'm basically allowing this level of investigator to make a decision. I can quickly categorize this. I can say, do something, don't do something. I can say, show me this only when they're in higher categories, et cetera. And then anything in my history now is saved inside of the graph database. And it also becomes part of that enriched graph. And that is another benefit of what's going on behind the scenes. So that's our first step. So we've seen that alert. Now, perhaps what I'd like to do is actually go look at a case. Now, again, if you have case management, we have lots of examples where we're doing this inside of other case managers. But in the concept of a case, I can go see now these connections that are in the graph database. They could be connections of alerts. They could be subjects. They could be people. They could be MAC IDs. All of that data now is all connected in this case. Now, I can pop over here and say, well, now perhaps I want to see the curated version of this. These are all the things that I need to go prosecute or file a SAR so that this is all together in one place. And the beauty of that now is that's been curated. Now, this may be an enormous network, but these are only the things that I want to do as far as this case, that now what I can do is go simply generate a SAR form. So what you've seen now in a matter of 10-ish minutes is that the full life cycle from detection to listing, I can now do this, and the system now is bringing up my accuracy and then allowing this process. Now, in my SAR form, we generate that. It has a little narrative. We can actually go fill out templates, right? So that's kind of the high level. Now, there's another level, which is, let's say these cases are a bit more complicated. Maybe this dashboard is for a level 3 person. Now, what I can do here now is very similar. You can see up here, I have that risk slider here, but in this case, I want to look even deeper. So maybe I'm looking at onboarding new customers, or maybe I'm looking at high net worth individuals or other corporations in my investigation. What I can start to do now is create a lower level risk, either at a party or an account. Now what I can do is use that very similar style here, where I can see a dashboard, I can see communities over here on the left, I can see what those things look like. But in one mouse click, I have now come over and I have identified that there is something more going on with this account or this business. Again, I have a very simple style that I saw in the previous one, but what I'm able to do now in this screen is actually dig even deeper. I can do something called pathfinding, which is this the only connection? Is there something more behind what my level 1 showed in the previous alert that perhaps they've sent to me? Maybe I want to go look at all of the connections here to SAR. I see that there's a high risk on this account. And in one sort of mouse click here, I can use this. And what it's going to do now is it's going to show me all of the other SARs that have been found. Well, wait a minute, there's much more involved here than just simply one bad actor. There is now a community and there are further connections. So what I've done now as a level 3 investigator is dig even deeper. Now, this is just a simple representation of what that is. The second thing that I can do here is I can start to look at time. By moving my first part of time down here, I can see when these activities track. So I can start to get more forensic with that. So again, I think what we wanted to show here is there are many vignettes. That's really kind of what our technology is as a sort of a quick preview. So with that, over to you, Michael.
God, thank you so much. I always enjoy learning more about where we could go for our customers to help them identify, not just the various sources of information, but how we can actually include humans in the loop along with machine learning and graph visualization and graph analytics as a holistic experience to drive better outcomes for AML investigations. Where we're going to go now is we're going to actually dive deeper on kind of graph analytics and kind of what role our platform plays in this approach. And so what we're showing here is the way that Gartner is thinking about graph is interesting. So they've identified 6 main types of graph analytics. This aligns very well with kind of the machine learning and graph analytics algorithms we leverage in terms of going from path to community to centricity to similarity to link prediction to connectivity. And basically what we're trying to do is basically give insight into the network of transactional flows that tie together a crime ring in a money laundering or a fraud situation. So these 6 types of graph analytics are powerful, and they really help us figure out kind of how to connect the dots and then how to drive outcomes. So next slide, please. We've been also recognized not just by Gartner, but also by Forrester. We were in the Magic Quadrant for operational databases, but we're also in the Graph Data Platforms Wave report that came out just over a year ago. We landed perfect scores in 9 different places, and we're very proud of this work, but we're also excited to know that we can extend these benefits to customers in a very powerful way, especially when it comes to AML. Scalability, we need to be able to see into all those transactions. Performance, we need answers back quickly. We need to be able to take on multiple workloads, multiple transaction types. We need to be able to search across this entire estate. And then we need to be able to bring up new data about both our initial load as well as ongoing updates. And then we need to extend that into other systems as well as we start to evolve the approach we take. Next slide, please. The tree of pain is just a great way to frame up kind of who cares why. And obviously we want to make money, save money, and protect money, but we also want to make sure that we're identifying kind of who are the roles and personas on the far right there. So we want to make sure that we are able to facilitate executive and management insight into what is happening with the business. We want investigators to be effective and show the right jurisprudence. We want the machine learning and data science teams need to be able to interoperate, and we think that graph is the best place to do data science. And Finally, we need to support the audit and compliance teams, as well as the IT teams that are going to be running these systems as well, whether that be in the cloud or on premise. And so if you look in the middle in terms of those strategic objectives and what those use cases are, you can see lots of different approaches that do come out of this framework to drive outcomes. And all this data lives in Microsoft Office. It lives in existing transactional systems and emerging transaction systems as well. And then you have external data sources. And that combines together to be able to support the range of financial crime detection and prevention, and ultimately put an end to anti-money laundering and ransomware and fraud. Next slide. When we think about kind of what specific work needs to be done, from a computational perspective, the fundamentals are pretty straightforward for us in the sense that we actually are looking into dependencies. We need to understand, kind of connecting the dots on a failure chain. We need to see into clusters. How are things related, and what distinctions can we draw between different groups? Similarity is related to clustering, but it actually is finding paths or patterns inside those groups. Matching and patterns also helps us highlight the variant of dependencies. So we combine both clustering and similarity into these patterns, and then we follow the flow of transactions, and we're following the money there as well. And then finally, we need to find, with centrality, we also need to ensure we can see which nodes are most important. In other words, which bad actors are central. When we start to dig into kind of on the left, you see the list of graph algorithms. On the right, you see the list of machine learning algorithms. And we can actually then kind of mix and match all of these into a very powerful framework that enables, as Scott showed us, what it means to be able to have explainable machine learning and explainable AI. Graph is immensely helpful for that because it actually does show it. Here's a logical framework that shows kind of how all the parts and pieces fit together. From left to right, we have all of our data sources, and we primarily rely on messaging queues like Kafka or Spark or MQ. We also interoperate with Informatica and Azure Data Factory and all the other tools that go from all those source systems into our graph database. Tiger Shield is the wrapper around our platform, and that's where we also apply enterprise logic and enterprise applications that help investigators, machine learning, and IT teams manage these environments. Next slide, please. So how's it work underneath? We start with heterogeneous data silos. We provide real-time updates. We bring that into the graph database. We apply machine learning inside the graph database. Then we start to get feedback results from training from the investigations themselves. And the machine learning then starts to also, we have a visualization capability, we have humans in the loop, we have AML logic that is applied here. And then we can actually start to go from alerts to SARs to outcomes to investigations to prosecution if necessary. Next slide. From a reference architecture, going back to some of the things that Harsh said, we have the service bus, we have Azure Data Factory for the pipelines, we have applications that we can connect with Azure API. We can also then augment what we do from a graph perspective with things like Elasticsearch, and then we can also integrate with the Microsoft Graph Data Connect. And we can connect to Azure Data Lake storage and other object stores and file systems. And then we can also leverage all the goodness of Azure Synapse Analytics to generate data products that can then be applied to Databricks, Azure Machine Learning, the app services, the machine learning APIs, and then ultimately we can connect again to other applications using the Azure APIs. So summary is that end to end, we work very, very well with inside the Azure context, and we interoperate with all of those services and capabilities that Azure brings to the table. Next slide. So, what's our path to success? What is the call to action today? We need to design the right architecture and pipelines. We need to have the right methodologies. We leverage graph features with external machine learning and also support in-graph machine learning. And then finally, as Harsh said before, we need to have a sustainable approach that's flexible and can plan for growth. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions real quick here. We can answer key questions that the audience has for us. Scott or Laura, back to you, please.
Yeah, I can take it from here, Scott, unless you have something else to add.
Yeah, no, I think there's just a couple of things that, sort of the last sort of thing that we want to do here, which is if you have any questions, we threw a lot at everybody today. There are some ways to get started. You heard Harsh talk about the playground, right? Which is sandbox, which is how do we start to do that? And I think that is really kind of what our takeaway here is that if you have lots of questions, we'll do that. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Laura. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just going to wrap it up. We do have a couple minutes here for Q&A, so definitely, if you have any and you're in the audience, drop them in the Q&A box and we can start answering those. We did have a couple that came through. Let's see, Michael, looks like one came through. How can we get started with TigerGraph?
So it's a great question. We love to point our friends to the TigerGraph starter kits, and we have one for AML. And then we also have a free tier that you can use on TigerGraph Cloud. And those are kind of the two starting points that we like to prompt. But please feel free to ask us if you'd like to actually have a walkthrough, because Scott and I and Harsh are all here to help drive a great experience.
Okay, thank you so much. And then Scott, there was another one that came through for you. How did the visuals connect with TigerGraph and other fraud detection systems we use internally?
Great question. So the primary API is REST as well as Direct Connect. So one of the interesting elements in what we saw today in Tiger Shield is that you can connect to other source systems and do something called a concatenated sort of a query. So we can query an Actimize or a Salesforce.com or an Oracle and look up a customer that may already exist in one of our source systems, use the REST API to query TigerGraph to show me the hidden network of connectivity. So the beauty of that now is we've built the entire architecture of Tiger Shield on that connected layer, and then algorithms and security and those kinds of things are all native inside of TigerGraph.
Great. Thank you guys so much. It looks like those were all of the questions that came through during the talks today. There was a question that came through about the recording. Just to finalize on that, we will be sending out the recording in an email. The registration email that you use to sign up for the webinar is the one we'll be using to send the recording. It'll also be on the Expero and TigerGraph websites if you want to review the recordings there. Other than that, that was all that we had today for the presentation. We hope you all enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, feel free to email any of us or respond to the email with the recording, and we'll be happy to set up a meeting. And we look forward to seeing all of you next time. Have a great day.
Thank you.